So let's not forget that Alvin Bragg not only is he setting precedent from bringing criminal charges for the very first time in this nation's history against a former president, but he's taking a case. And this is the hush money that was paid to Stormy Daniels back in 2016, just before the election. He's taking a case that the feds said they wouldn't prosecute. Here comes the former president. Let's just listen into this.
President Trump, will you come speak to us, President Trump?
Oh, that was just fun.
Wow. And he went right into the courtroom. We thought that he was going to come up to that camera, but change of plans to what we had been advised.
Yes, folks. A day which will live in infamy. Mr. President Trump has been arraigned on charges, 38 charges, I believe his number.
We should know.
We'll be getting into that. People may know I am a grand jury expert.
Matt, I'm very thankful that you were able to take the time out of your busy schedule after being the deciding vote in pressing charges against Donald Trump.
Yes, exactly. I was in there, even though I'm from Brooklyn, I was in the Manhattan grand jury room. I finagled my way out thanks to Alvin Bragg and George Soros. And I got my way onto that. And me and 11 other resistance libs basically guarded the actual law. Along with the district attorney, and said, impeach the motherfucker already, the dang Cheeto. And no, we will talk about that Trump's arraignment in the and I will share my experience as a grand juror. I've served 6 out of 20 days on the grand jury in Brooklyn. And I can't get into details of any of those cases there, but I can talk about the sort of general process and what it might have been like. And we'll do that in the post game this evening.
Yeah. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. And just a little bit, we're going to be talking about UAW stuff. And we're going to be debuting a new segment after that called Quick Takes. But we started a little bit late, so we might need to jump right into this top line story of the evening, Matt, if you're good. And that's what's happening in Tennessee. We still need to do our gun episode on the program. We've been talking about that for a little while. But people know that, like, I'm not somebody who's in 100% aligned with the kind of dominant contemporary, like, gun discourse on, like, the liberal left, right? And I just say that up top to say that this fight is about something so much bigger than even like guns or common sense gun reform in this country. I mean, this is a basic democratic question, and understandably and thankfully, I think this has gotten a decent amount of coverage. I think it deserves a lot more because, for all the crying that we're going to get about the Trump prosecution that's going on, this is probably one of the most clear examples of a direct threat to democracy. I mean, I don't know. I don't need to put all these things on a hierarchy, but like even more in some ways than some of the gerrymandering or all these other kinds of things, like straight up expelling members of the House of Tennessee, I think is a real, true travesty. I think everybody knows the backstory here, but I'll just sort of break it down right quick for folks. Is that last week there's a protest in support of basic gun reform in the state of Tennessee, a state that, like Texas, has been sort of like sprinting forward and trying to eradicate any kind of basic gun protection to gun laws. I will just say, as I always note to folks, that as a Southerner myself, like the thing that's always frustrating to me about the way these things get framed is that like we're returning back to our roots. Well, if you look at states like Tennessee, if you look at states like my home state of Texas, the first things that a lot of these governments did actually was restrict your ability to be carrying a firearm or knife out in public places. Putting all that aside for a second, student protest, understandable after a mass shooting in the state of Tennessee, right? Truly, in a lot of ways, an example of what a democracy looks like, right? People are frustrated with what they're getting from their government. They show up in person to protest to show their dissatisfaction with it. Well, the Republican-controlled legislature wasn't having it, and is now attempting to expel 3 Democratic members from the state house in Tennessee, for a lack of decorum, for participating in these protests, which again were like extremely mild. And look, for a party that just up the road from me in Waco just had a big rally for Donald Trump that was celebrating the January 6th, moment. It's like it's pretty wild to now sit around and say that like, oh, these people were protesting inside the state capitol. You can't have that, right? Um, I wanted to play a couple things right quick for y'all because it's getting really serious. There's going to be a vote on Thursday, unless you see significant Republican breaking in it. Very likely that these members will be expelled just because of how dominated the legislature is there by Republicans. But I'm just going to play a short segment of this. This is from yesterday, where one of the members who is at threat of being expelled from the Tennessee State House, Justin Jones, is assaulted by another member of the Tennessee legislature.
And just to be clear, who is Jones in this video?
Jones is good point. Jones is the one who's holding the camera, so you aren't going to see him. You're going to see Republican member Lafferty, who strikes him. Sorry. And look, I mean, like, that's not like a bump. That's a hit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like, if you're talking about behavior that's sort of unbecoming of an elected official, I think striking somebody on the House floor, I mean, we have a nasty history in this country of doing that. And like the focus on these 3 representatives is ridiculous, as people have rightfully pointed out time and time again. There are members of the House right now who have assaulted teenagers who didn't face this kind of pushback from the State House. Lafferty, it's his opinion, but should also be noted, is somebody who has gone on record as saying that the 3/5 compromise was actually an attempt to slow roll slavery, right? Which is like the height of revision, right? Like, what can we say here other than just sort of putting the facts out? This is a direct threat to democracy. We're talking about 210,000 Tennesseans who the Republicans in government are basically saying, we're going to wipe the slate clean. Y'all don't get representatives of your own choosing, right? Because we have a majority in the state house, right? Like, this is as clear as it gets to subverting democracy. This isn't like a kind of like, oh, we've made voting harder, so maybe some people are going to be less inclined to vote, or we're prosecuting people who make minor mistakes on their voter registration. This is as clear as it gets. We're going to overturn elections effectively in these areas and take these people out of their positions.
Yeah, and we're going to get to Keith in a second, but I mean, the similar things going on with Wisconsin. Finally, you see the results of Scott Walker 10 years ago, basically taking over the state, attacking unions and gerrymandering to the point where they often have more cumulative votes and huge margins. The Democrats do, and still lose to Republicans, never really controlling those legislatures. But you have a situation where they could vote for the Supreme Court to be 4-3 Democrat, even though it's like not they don't say Democrat or Republican. We all know which way they are. And then you have another simultaneously a state Senate race, and the Republicans say, if we win that, we'll get a 2/3 majority in the Senate, and we'll probably just impeach one of your Supreme Court justices anyway. Like, this is more troubling than a president getting arraigned on indictment to me.
I think it's as simple as it gets when this is the kind of moment where you probably need to get some kind of federal intervention, right?
Yes. I don't know. Yeah, like exactly. Like we talked about, I don't know if that's Merrick Garland saying, hey, this is a civil rights violation to basically throw people's representatives out for protesting. Like, I don't know what the form is, but something, Brandon, would be Joe Brandon would be nice.
And before, we'll be covering this, so the vote will be on Thursday. I'm doing a Griscom stream on Thursday, so I'll talk about that amongst other things. I do just have to throw this up here because it wouldn't be Left Reckoning if we didn't make this point. Because anytime something like this happens, you of course get all these anti-Southern takes from people in the media. Soledad O'Brien being the embodiment of it this week, saying, Tennessee people, why do you elect these ignorant people? And again, like we're talking about a significant portion, just like in every state, of people who aren't Republicans, who are straight up having their right to be represented by whom they choose being threatened. And there is like a very clear attempt to subvert that. I think Afton Ben on Twitter really like highlighted this well. It's challenging when they've rigged elections, neutered local power, and removed our ability to pass popular ballot measures. And there's a very famous meme now, if you haven't seen it before, don't make me tap the sign. The South is full of good people that are on your side, that are held back by gerrymandering, disenfranchisement, and regressive politics, right? And that's just like, that's the state of the nation, frankly, not just the state of the South. When you're talking about building working class politics in this country. But Lord, if we could maybe show some solidarity with folks and try to find ways that we can help people who are pushing back against this kind of stuff, instead of deciding to attack a bunch of poor and working class people anytime something bad happens in the South, I would be very thankful.
Yeah, should have voted better. It's just crazy
voted
detached.
more, right? It's just like, I don't know. It's just
Insane.
like, it's like, yeah, anyway, that's a whole other conversation. We've done it a bunch. It's ludicrous. It's silly. And I'm pretty damn tired of it, especially when the stakes are as high as they are.
All right, folks. Now we are going to welcome to the show Keith Brower Brown. Keith is a correspondent for Labor Notes. You can read his writing in Labor Notes as well as Jacobin and in these times on this UAW reform process. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here. Thanks for having me on, Dave.
Yeah, happy to do it.
We are excited to touch on this. We talk a lot about electoral politics and sort of the democratization and pressure there. And this story, I think, is a bit of a breath of fresh air. Now, just to get everybody on the same page, what is the UAW and what is its place in American labor?
Right. So UAW, in general, stands for United Auto Workers, but also represents a ton of agricultural implement workers at John Deere, a ton of graduate student workers like me at the University of California, now make up almost a quarter of the 400,000 members of the UAW. And then over half are in auto and other manufacturing still. And then there's a smattering of like public workers, museum workers, logistic workers also in the mix.
And so this reform process, we talk about unions as just you achieve a union and you've democratized the workplace. I think is maybe a naive way of looking at this thing. Of course, these unions have their own sort of undemocratic structures. Talk about the UAW, the conditions inside the UAW, and you can get as historical as you want. With regards to what sort of how like responsive this organization is to its membership and leading up to these reform efforts.
Sure. So unions have this promise to be the most democratic institutions in society, where we, the workers, as members, figure out how we're going to take on the boss together. And yet, a lot of times, it's really hard to do that in practice. There are real obstacles to bringing people working 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week into setting the course of a huge 400,000 person organization. So in the UAW, there's probably no union that better epitomizes both the sort of rise and fall of American labor in most people's minds than this union, where you have this huge upsurge in the 1930s of militant sit-down strikes and really creative worker leadership on the floor. A ton of different left currents active in the union. Then in the late 40s, early 50s, you have this sort of lockdown of a ruling group, which comes to be known as the Administration Caucus, which then for the last 70 years has been the one-party state of the UAW and has made the entire staff and leadership apparatus at the higher levels totally fused with this caucus, where nobody on the board, with one exception in all that time. On the top board of the UAW was not from this caucus. So it's pretty tight lockdown. Of course, this doesn't really matter to most members or come up, except for the fact that the union is making huge concessions during this time. In the 50s and 60s, it becomes sort of the leader of setting the bar for the American labor movement, winning cost of living adjustments, or COLA, and thus sort of taking the rising cost of living out of the equation for workers, which was, at the time, was sort of a compromise, but now looks like, damn, we want to get that back.
Yeah.
So winning stuff like that makes it this leader across the labor movement. It does pattern bargaining, where you have one of Ford, Chrysler, GM bargain or go on strike first, and then that sets the pattern for others. And then other unions pattern their contract off the UAW auto contracts. So that was the leadership. But then, without continuing to develop democracy and militancy at the roots of the union, you start to see some of that power fall apart. And the auto companies and their investors start to say, we can break this union by basically shifting a lot of production to anti-union states in the South, some of it overseas, but more than that, just like shifting around production into subsidiaries, into lower tiers of work. So saying, oh, this is actually parts work now. This is something that you union auto workers don't have to do, or you're going to be paid half as much for doing. So especially in the recession, the union leadership starts to agree to these contracts where there's these really stark differences. If you're a new worker after 2008, you will never get a pension. You will never get healthcare after retirement. Your wage is going to be lower from day one. And most of that has not been made up since. Some of the wages, but the pension and healthcare is not. So that pissed off a lot of auto workers for understandable reasons, and started to foster a really apparently a pretty powerful movement to take back our union. There had been prior reform movements going back to the 50s, when this one party state started. There's always been people fighting. Really important upsurges in the late 60s and 70s of Black workers in Detroit, especially in Kansas City, St. Louis, Texas area in the 80s. But it was really this last upsurge that finally went over the crest. We won the right to democratic elections about a year and a half ago, and then won those first elections.
Could you break down what that means for folks who aren't familiar with the democratic elections mean?
Yeah. So in a lot of unions, the top leadership is not directly elected by members. You don't get a vote for the president of your own union in a lot of cases. Instead, your union local elects delegates. So you get to vote for a delegate to a national convention, but these are often uncontested elections, and it's basically just local leaders who end up winning or basically appointing people who are uncontested. So those delegates then pick the president and pick the whole top leadership board, and it's sort of like a snake eating its own tail of people patting each other on the back and saying like, okay, we're going to keep running this thing together. And it's hard to challenge and break into that. So in the last sort of 5 to 8 years, a huge corruption scandal broke in the UAW that key figures, including presidents in the administration caucus, were embezzling money, were making backroom deals with the auto corporations themselves to give auto workers worse contracts, essentially. And we're getting golf bags and stupid stuff out of it, but we're selling out their duty in a lot of ways. And as a result of that, a federal monitor was appointed that came in. Similar process happened in the Teamsters and in the Laborers Union in the 80s and 90s, respectively. And in this case, the monitor said, we're going to require a referendum where every member gets to vote on whether they want the right to vote for the top officers. So we had a first vote just to say, do we want direct elections? We said yes by almost 2/3. Big surprise. People voted that they wanted to vote. And then finally, we got our chance to actually campaign on a vision for what we wanted for the union. And we had been pushing, I think, all along this idea that we needed to end concessions in the tier system and in corruption. And that's been the rallying cry of the UAWD caucus, or Unite All Workers for Democracy, going back to its inception about 4 or 5 years ago.
Before we get into the UAD caucus, were there rationalizations for the continued lack of democracy, or did it just kind of continue through inertia? Like, I guess early, like for a good portion, it was like, we're delivering goods. And then it was like, well, we delivered goods relatively recently. And is it now just a case where it's like, well, no one within living memory remembers when this was actually working for anybody?
That's totally a problem. Shifting to a new system always brings some qualms, but I think there were some defenses of the old system. For the first time in history, the administration caucus actually came out as a public force. It had never admitted its own existence or its own name, even though everybody knew it. And it created this website that was called Protect the Wheel. And the wheel is the logo of the UAW, the sacred symbol of our solidarity. And they said, we have to protect the wheel, protect our union by allowing experienced people to, our delegates, to make this decision and hash it out together in a room, rather than just the chaos of open-ended demagoguery in the membership. And there is this implication that the members can't be trusted in the same way that these, more experienced leaders can be. Aside from that, I think there's also sort of some voices saying, well, there could be selfishness. Instead of looking out for retirees, or instead of looking out for the new organizing needs, because obviously we're at 10% union membership in this country, we need to be organizing a lot more workers. What if we're just looking out for our own, current wages or something like that? But again, I think that assumes a lot too little of most union members. That being a part of a union shows you the power of solidarity when we're at our best, and shows you why we need to fight on behalf of a broader multiracial working class in a way that, being a union leader, making a really solid salary might not be a better guide to that than just being a rank and file worker.
So, not to preempt too much what we're going to talk about specifically with the UAW, but Keith, I'm curious if you were just mentioning how low union density is in this country. You were mentioning the corruption scandals, and I think that there is a real need, and I think we're seeing in the UAW, we're seeing it in the Teamsters, we're seeing in a lot of union movements in this country to really democratize these structures and these systems. I see sometimes because the union movement has been on the back foot for my life, right? And probably the generation before me too, that sometimes amongst people, there's a hesitancy to sort of be able to play ball on two different fronts, right? Recognizing that we need to be expanding union membership in this country. And also within the union movement itself, we definitely need a lot more democratization. I'm just curious for you, as somebody who writes about this, as somebody who has a union member, how do you sort of, walk that line where it's we're not playing into, for example, the union busters who are going to come in there and say, oh, these are all corrupt, blah, blah, blah. They're not democratic. They don't want to support you, right? Making these criticisms and trying to build and make the union move more democratic without sort of falling into anti-union talking points is what I'm asking.
That's a really important goal. I mean, we're in a very, despite the 70% of Americans who say they like the idea of unions, it's a very hostile world to try and organize labor. And I think for UAWD, the key has been to focus on positive reforms that will strengthen the power of the rank and file in fighting the boss. Just keep bringing back to fighting the boss. We do, one of the 3 top slogans: no tiers, no concessions, no corruption. Corruption is there. A lot of people are pissed about that for understandable reasons, but that has not been a major focus of what we've put forward at UAW conventions, like the one last summer, the one last week. We've really focused on getting bigger and earlier strike pay to strengthen the ability of more workers to go out and strike. And we won major reforms on that last summer. At this last convention last week, we were pushing for stronger strike preparation and a real contract campaign that would get members putting pressure on the boss and organizing each other creatively, not just waiting around for September for the bargaining team to figure stuff out and then maybe call a strike. So focusing on those sort of like concrete ways that we're going to beat the boss is the key. Union democracy on its own matters to some people, but if you really want to get a lot of busy, tired, stressed out people to realize that we can be stronger by fighting this out together, we got to bring it back to fighting the boss.
And what are some of those? Like, how do you make that pitch?
Well, it's not hard when the boss has been as brutal as they have been in auto, and I mean across the UAW and higher ed too. There's been a lot of really brutish, low wages and discriminatory and harassing bosses, across the board. So, having a stronger approach to striking, both in terms of advanced preparation, building up more member-led kind of contract campaigns, has been an idea we've been trying to build up. Also, a very labor notes kind of approach, but across many unions is there. There's a real, focus on tiers as this essential divide and conquer strategy from the boss that we need to get beyond. And there's a version of that in auto, in other parts of manufacturing, certainly in higher ed with adjuncts and many different tiers of workers doing similar work for very unequal pay and security. So those issues have helped us talk to each other across sectors. And yeah, I think that trying to keep focused on, we're going to do these reforms internally in our union so that we can get back to fighting the boss and have a lot more strength to do it has been the key. We haven't always made that clear enough, or, it's a hard thing to convey, but apparently it was clear enough in the end that we were able to win a majority of the top board of the top officers of the union in this election, including the presidency. And now the ball is in the court of reformers to essentially deliver on these strategies. And it's going to be a tall order. This is the harder, better work to have cut out for us. But I feel pretty hopeful.
I mean, let's talk about this reform movement. I mean, could you talk about Sean Fain and this UAW presidential campaign?
Sure. So Sean Fain was the candidate of the Reform Caucus and sort of broader coalition of reformers across the UAW under the Members United slate. He is a proud UAWD member and came to UAWD events to really say how proud he was to be a member and participate in the last week convention and prior. So that's pretty special to have a union president now who is, an active participant in rank and file caucus that, goes beyond the situation, the Teamsters, where you have allies of the rank and file caucus who have made it to presidency. So very excited about that. Sean comes out of being an electrician in the UAW in Indiana, and then becoming a local president, a leader among skilled trades workers, joining international staff as a rep, and being a very rare kind of dissident voice within the UAW International Union, speaking out against concessions. And then there were a bunch of other auto worker local leaders elected to the top officer board, like Margaret Mock, who comes out of a Chrysler Stellantis local and becomes now secretary treasurer. And then there was one higher ed worker, former president of the Harvard Grad Students Union, who gets elected the president or the regional director of the Northeast region that includes a lot of higher ed units. So nice mix, sort of very closely tracks the actual membership of the union. And just one last person I'll mention I'm very excited for is Dan Vicente, who just a couple of weeks ago was working on the shop floor in Pennsylvania in a shipbuilding or manufacturing facility, and ran, just with great principles and a strong movement behind him, and ended up being a very entrenched regional director.
I mean, I can't tell you, just like from what I've been seeing in the UAW to what I've been seeing in the Teamsters, like feeling very excited to see what's going to happen over the next couple of years. I'm curious, if you could give folks a sense, I know it's not always as easy as people would like, but y'all labor notes do a good job at this. Like, what's the makeup of these voters? I mean, like, who is showing up and supporting this campaign? In general.
Well, I'm not going to go all Nate Silver on you with like a detailed
Yeah.
breakdown.
Top line, what's exciting? Like anything
Yeah.
you saw when you got into it that was like, oh, that's interesting, or
Yeah. So there are about 400,000 active members of the UAW today and about 600,000 retirees. And retirees had the right to vote in this election. And that's something that reformers campaigned for to ensure they would. Their pensions are run in significant part by the union. So really important that they should have a say. We actually campaigned for them to have the right to run as candidates too, but the incumbents admin caucus shot that down. So in any case, it was sort of this big question mark how they would come, but it turned out that retirees in general were quite supportive of reform, which was not something you could necessarily guess in advance. Then among the big three auto companies, there is this clear sort of trend where Chrysler, Stellantis, as it's now called, which has been the most sort of brutally treated by the boss in a lot of ways, has had the worst shake on the shop floor. They pushed really hard for reform. They voted really strongly for the Members United reformer slate. Then Ford, which has sort of gotten the best shake and has had, in some ways, the most profitable corporation and gotten a slightly better deal along the way, and has been sort of the apple of the eye of UAW leadership for years. They ended up pretty heavily backing the incumbents, with a few exceptions. And then GM sort of fell in the middle. And other sectors were mixed, but higher ed only made up about 2.5% of voters overall, even though it's closer to 25% of membership.
That was like a low voter turnout, or
low voter turnout? Yeah, reflecting a lot of factors, high turnover of members in those locals because people leave within 5 to 7 years. And also for auto workers, the international union negotiates your contract, is directly the bargaining team, is the top leadership of the union. In a higher ed local like mine at the University of California, you elect your own local bargaining team who handles stuff. So the international is kind of just this far away thing where, we did get 84% support for reformers out here, but turnout was low no matter our efforts, just because it's like so far from the mind of your everyday concerns.
Do members from closed shops have the right to vote in these?
Yeah, good question. If they're retirees, they do.
Okay.
Can you guys explain the terminology closed shop?
So with all those plant closures that I was mentioning earlier that were by design of the corporations to help bust the union as much as they could, you have huge numbers of locals that basically their plant no longer exists. And so there's still a local number. There, in some cases, might still be like a local organization of retirees or members who used to work there who stay in touch. I'd have to get back to you on where the line is drawn for those, but there are definitely closed locals that turn in numbers, and my assumption is that most of them were.
This, people might have to check me on this later. I think I was reading Jonah Furman's sort of recap of this, and he was saying that like there were some early signalings that like a lot of people who were in places where their shop closed were voting more heavily for the reformers. But again, I don't know if they were retirees or whatnot. But again, makes sense in a sense that like if your shop closes, that you might want to change in leadership. And I know we got a lot more to get to. So just since we have you here, though, I think it is helpful. And I know you probably get this a lot from folks because a lot of people are a little confused as to the graduate student side of the union and the auto worker union. I mean, could you just give people a general sense about how that came to be? Because I think it's just a question we get every single time we bring up the UAW.
Sure. Yeah, I've been asked by plenty of auto workers too at these conventions, like, how did this end up happening? Uh, in the 80s and 90s, as graduate students started to take on more of the labor on campuses and be more exploited as a result, there started to be this growth and interest in unionizing. In the 90s, there was a huge success at the University of California, unionizing across all 10 campuses at once, essentially. And that became what is now the second largest local in the whole UAW. And then postdoctoral researchers and some other kinds of research staff unionized with UAW soon after there. A lot of other universities have followed into the UAW, and it's now the largest union of grad student workers. Why did the UAW take a chance and support and bring in these workers is a little hard to read, because it wasn't a super open democratic decision-making process at the time at the top level. There are theories ranging from just a good faith belief that this was a way to expand the labor movement, to a more kind of suspicious read that the administration caucus at the time thought this would be a way to get in a lot of new members who will pay a lot of dues and will not be as pissed off or have their jobs as threatened as auto workers. So it'll be kind of like a stable dues base when a lot of the rest are leaving. And I don't go in too far for, trying to figure out exactly how it all played out. But at this point, I think it has been a really fruitful collaboration in the reform movement between the different, sides of the union. And, it's certainly not grad students running the show.
Actually, just to be really clear about that, because there's all this discourse about like the PMC or whatever. I'm sure you're familiar with it. This is not just so we're very clear here for anybody who's listening and thinks that what happened is the UAW expanded and they got a bunch of fancy folks from Columbia or NYU or, no offense, University of California system, and they overthrew the old guard at the opposition of the membership. No, as you were just saying, the votes in this most recent election was 2% of 2.5% were grad students. I think it'd be even better if it was 20%, right? Fully. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing in and of itself, but also just so we're operating from the sense of reality and not creating these weird tensions that I think a lot of online left media is starting to get really good at doing, is trying to find ways to divide the labor movement between itself. So anyway, sorry not to cut you off, but I just want to be very explicit about that for anyone listening.
Back to the auto workers, can we move to why this is actually an important point in automaking history, that we start to democratize this workplace? David's been talking about this electric vehicles as something we need to make sure is not an end around union shops. So can you just touch a little bit on electric vehicles? Then we can maybe broaden out to the green economy larger.
Definitely. So right now, basically the entire US auto industry is shifting hard towards electric vehicles. And, GM has said majority by 2030, we're talking the end of this decade, the majority of their vehicles they're selling going to be electric vehicles. May end up being faster because CEOs, turns out, love electric vehicles a lot of the time, because it saves on labor costs and it is a union busting strategy, as it's been conceived a lot of the time from investors and executives at these companies, where they're going to move a large amount of production out of these top tier union factories into non-union joint ventures or subsidiaries that are paid at parts wages or even worse, where you have temporary workforces where you're trying to simplify the production process and cut out the union as much as possible. And so far, unfortunately, they've succeeded at that more than you would like. This kind of began in a spicy side story under the recession again. Obama, as part of the bailout of the automakers, said, well, it wasn't Obama's help, but part of this deal that he supported and pushed through was that the factory where the Chevy Volt was being made at the time, the sort of pilot of this whole EV model, was going to be at a lower tier to try and save money for the company. And that ended up in some significant ways setting a template for the whole auto industry, that this is going to be lower tier work. We're going to get away with making, the drivetrain of the car at what we used to pay someone who makes, just the siding on a door or something like that and turns out some plastic piece. But this is, extremely technical work, a lot of the time doing chemical engineering adjacent kinds of work, beyond my chemistry abilities for sure. So a big, almost existential question for the UAW in this moment is, how do you make sure this work is not just unionized, but at top tiers? And to that challenge, a major theme of Sean Fain's campaign and of the convention last week was, we're going to unionize this transition. We're not going to allow these companies to say, just because they're shuffling the work into some shady joint venture, that it doesn't fall under a UAW contract. We're going to demand this year in the contract negotiations that the EV work all falls under our contracts already. New plants are going to be automatically unionized, would be the takeaway from that. But then actually boosting up that work to a higher tier might be a longer battle. We'll see. If we get rid of significant parts of tiers in the contract as well, that would be two birds with one stone. You would bring up the EV work too. And then there's a whole question of how you help those workers in these emerging plants, especially if they're, in Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, getting a lot of this EV work. How do you help those workers themselves build up strong fighting democratic unions, not just show up, oh, you have a union, great, but actually really help them lead what this union will become in EV workplaces? That's going to be a key question for us to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's critical in a lot of ways, not just in the UAW, but like you see here in Texas, and I'm assuming in the rest of the country, like, solar panel installation is like oftentimes sort of put up against organized labor here. And there's this kind of mentality. It's like, oh, it's green, it's good. And it's like, totally, let's build more green stuff. Let's save the environment. But like, capitalists and bosses want to do the same shit that they have always done, whether or not it's a combustion engine or an EV vehicle. So this is like a fairly, this is like recent, the change in like the more direct democracy. Are there any things else that are sort of happening within the union in addition to like being able to vote for leadership that you might want to highlight as things that are making it feel more democratic? Or is it really like this ability for union members to have influence over leadership that is like the crux of this reform?
The emergence of a strong rank and file caucus is itself kind of a step forward, to have a space for workers, no matter if they're on their first day, rank and file, newbie, to local president, can all hash out ideas together. That's pretty new for at least decades, and is a really good step. And UAWD has been really committed to serious internal democracy and welcoming people from different sectors. So that's a good step. Still has lots of room to grow, but this moment is one where that could happen fast. Beyond that, there's been a turn towards more striking recently across a bunch of different workplaces, and I have witnessed with my own eyes how the immediate kind of stakes of a strike bring out a creativity from rank and file workers in a way that a lot of other kinds of union activity, it's harder to get there. But when suddenly it's like, wait, we're risking losing our jobs, or our contract is on the line, and there's a picket line and you're either on one side or the other, that can really bring out a kind of solidarity, of communal creativity, of risk taking that helps the union be this living, fighting animal going forward. So the fact that we had a major strike at John Deere a few years ago that inspired people across our union, across many different sectors, GM went on strike in 2019, not a super successful strike, disappointing in key ways, but also showed that there's this continued willingness to strike. And that's an amazing thing about the UAW that you might expect with that sort of anti-democratic leadership for a long time, that striking wouldn't really be a muscle anymore. Well, actually, when strike votes happen in auto and other parts of the UAW, they usually pass by 95, 98%. And then participation is super high in auto strikes in the UAW, where everybody knows, like, you turn out, you do not cross the line. So how that has been maintained is its whole own deep history to figure out, but it's exciting and makes it feel like a September auto strike and one of the big three automakers this fall, with a combination of this more militant leadership that's going to draw a hard line and build a stronger contract campaign, a caucus helping build that from below, a rank and file that's clearly pissed off enough to boot the old leaders, and this enduring muscle of striking together, that could start to win back a huge amount of what's been lost.
That'd be huge. Unless you have anything else, Matt, do we want to talk about DSA?
Yeah, I'm just curious, Keith. I watched your talk with DSA on the Revolutionary Green New Deal. I'm just curious, we talk a lot about DSA attempting to impact things on the electoral front. How do you conceive of DSA's role on the labor front?
Sure. So I've been a member of East Bay DSA since late 2016 and have helped out with a lot of strike support campaigns. And I think that's sort of the no-brainer, really useful way that DSA can help back strikes by turning out members to picket lines. I've seen DSA in Oakland be the key sort of community support organization for the Oakland teacher strike, and then a public healthcare worker strike here a couple of years later. Not just turning out picket lines, but also organizing food for picket lines and for kids missing school, helping organize childcare, all that sort of creative. This is like mutual aid in a moment where it's like really mutual, where it's like, this is going to help the class have a breakthrough. And it, brought everybody together. Even people who've been fighting about mutual aid like 3 months before are like, okay, this is a moment where it's totally worth doing. So beyond picket support and strike solidarity, there's spreading the word about labor. A handful of different chapters do like local newsletters or like reporting, interviews with workers, sort of like a mini labor notes approach. I think that's a great thing to do, even just as a way for members to learn about what's going on and build some connections. Political education, I think, might be the most sort of like enduring, but sort of behind the scenes role of DSA. I've seen, for myself and for tons of other people active in this UAW reform movement, that DSA was a place where they learned a lot about politics and how to organize, sometimes organizing electoral campaigns, sometimes strike solidarity, sometimes in socialist night schools. And that's, I think, a really important role for it to play going forward, is just being this landing pad for new leftists to figure out where to plug in, maybe take a union job down the line. Maybe.
I mean, I love the rank and file strategy a lot, personally. Me
too. Big fan. Yeah. It's beautiful to see, hundreds of DSAers at least. And I'm sure there are plenty that are beyond my view who have taken jobs in nursing, as electricians, as teachers, with a vision helping build fighting unions. And there's just a power you can have from being a union member, working with people every day together, that you're not going to have as just like an outside activist. And we need a lot more of that. There's an organization starting up soon called the Rank and File Project, having a national launch in the next month or so, if I remember right, that's sort of aimed at helping more people do that, whether they're fully socialists or just sort of young radicals looking to help change the world in some way and want some mentorship. So I'm excited to see more of that happen.
Do we want to get to our boy Maddie for a second?
Well, I feel like we kind of already addressed the Matt
Yeah.
Iglesias.
I just, if we're not going to get to him, I just have to say, when I was in college in DC, Matty Iglesias would come to my bar that I worked at all the time in a
Bad
Vox
tipper?
t-shirt. Awful tipper. And like, look, I'm nobody. Like, if you don't drink, that's fine. But he would sit there for fucking like 4 hours with people, and would just drink Coke, which I never charged anybody for Coke because it felt wrong. Would leave nothing, and would always wear Vox branded shit with the fucking mustard stain on it. And I don't know. Funny guy. But no, I mean, really, really appreciate you coming on and chatting with us, Keith. I mean, this is I think what's happening again in the UAW. I think across the labor movement in general, it should like like the excitement for unions in this country is great. Seeing more militancy from unions themselves, I think, should get you even more excited, because that's how they build. When people say, "Oh, that's the thing that's going to improve my life,"
Mhm.
which I think should be the focus of all of our politics.
Absolutely. Yeah, this year with UPS hopefully going on a incredible strike, and one of the UAW big three going on a strike, could be a real turnaround for private sector union militancy. So excited to be a part of it with you and a lot of the folks hopefully listening.
Well, thank you so much, Keith. We're gonna have. Oh,
yeah.
sorry, Matt.
I was just gonna say, Keith, where should people follow you so they can keep abreast of this?
Sure. So I'll be writing for Labor Notes about the UAW and electric vehicles throughout this year. Labornotes.org. Tons of resources for how to build your union and current coverage there. And then I have a Twitter at Trails and Ways. You can follow me there, although I'm a pretty minimal poster, but good when I do.
It seems like you're using your time a little bit more wisely.
I think so, friend. Yeah, but thank you so much, Keith. We'd love to do it again sometime in the future. And yeah, folks, definitely keep abreast on Keith's work at Labor Notes.
Thank you both. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, Keith. See you.
Also, friends, if this wasn't enough of a labor injection, next week we're also going to have Paul Prescott on the show, who is an organizer now with the Teamsters himself. Y'all know him and love him from the Jackman Show. Great show. I'm sad that's not on anymore.
Yeah.
He's going to be talking to us about Tony Mazzocchi, who is a very famous and excellent American labor leader and thinker and writer. Really looking forward to that. And like,
that's two left reckoning guests who have run for office, not one, and then gone into being the labor movement, because Chris is down there with a
better way to go about it. Do you know what I mean? Like,
it's funny.
In terms of post-electoral careers.
Yeah, it's like actually like, oh, that's even better.
I'm not trying to start flame wars.
Probably like
better probably than just spending all of your time attacking the left, like some folks have done in maybe the San Francisco area. But let's we can move on from that. No, I'm really excited. I mean, that was really great talking with Keith. And like, look, I mean, like, this is something that like, trying to find the balance here where it's like, we got to build up the labor movement in this country. There's no doubt about it. But also like, we're not just like libs, you know what I mean? When it comes to labor movement, we want real, strong, working class, rooted, militant labor unions. Like, that's what we need. Right. Yeah. And like, I don't think it's a good idea to sort of just like deliver this enthusiasm to systems that like are riddled with problems without saying like, we got to build a labor movement and we also have to make these more democratic. It's like a two-tiered thing. And I think the cowardice might be too strong of a word, but like the quiet way that a lot of people talk about this, I think isn't good. Like, you can say like UAW is great. We want to see the UAW grow. It's even better when they have more militant rank and file leadership than they might have had in the past.
And the idea that you can, sort of give rise to a culture of political debate and sort of like internal debate is amazing. Like, that, like, it sounds like the PRI, like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the one party state for decades and decades. Like, really, and that you get instead everybody engaged, that just creates, like, think of all the different like that just you don't develop like a Mick Lynch, I feel like, when you don't have
Yeah.
that sort of debate, right? Like, I just feel like that, and
No,
maybe I'm giving
totally.
the RMT too much credit, but like, I just feel like that is a product of that sort of like active, engaged sort of membership. And I mean, that's really, it's,
Well, that's what
yeah.
a union like has to be. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And like, there's a big difference, for example, between making those critiques and doing what like the World Socialist website did when they showed up to workers on a picket line and were trying to selectively quote them to make it seem like they were against the miners' union, right? Like, that's bad.
Right.
That's not how you do that.
Right.
Anyway, so we're gonna go to the post game in just a couple minutes. Don't forget, folks. Oh, I gotta change this right quick so we can do this. Don't forget, folks, you can leave us a message at 1-940-289-7234. We'll be talking about a couple other things, taking y'all's calls and questions. But we're going to talk about the Trump stuff. You know, at a certain point, like, I don't know, everyone knows it. I think Matt and I are going to talk more holistically about what we think about it. I think Matt and I generally agree, but maybe there'll be a friendly debate. You'll have to see at patreon.com /left reckoning. I wanted to do a quick segment that we're debuting this week, and we're going to probably do more of these, which we're going to call quick takes, right? Where we sort of take a topic and we talk about it for a couple minutes before we run. And this week, I wanted to talk about an idea that I think is too hegemonic, to use a fancy word, on the left right now. I'm going to talk about it actually more technically and theoretically during the Griscom stream this week. I've been working on it for a little while, but maybe as just a teaser, I wanted to talk about some of the tendencies that we see on the left when it comes to talking about the general public. I don't know if you have this aversion that I do, Matt. I don't like the term normie that
No,
people
yeah.
use. I think it's really alienating. I get what people are trying to get at. Like, there's no doubt about it that people who consume a lot of political media and all this kind of stuff maybe aren't representative of like the general media consumption habits of the general population.
Hmm.
But it creates this weird divide, right? Between like you as a listener, you as a creator, whatever, and like the rest of the public. Because like, look, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm, out of line here, but like, I find myself to be a fairly normal person. Like, I don't make a lot of money. I have to work on the side. I live in the same community I grew up in. I live in the same town I grew up in. I talk to my neighbors, I talk to my friends, etc. Right. And like, I've always just been like a working class kid. Maybe one thing that's unique about me is that, like, yes, I am a socialist, right? But I came to that from being from where I'm from being a working class person, from wanting a better world. And these kind of weird walls that people create between themselves and like the rest of society, I don't think is a very good tactic for building like solidarity and community and all these kind of things, right?
Right.
But that's a minor quibble. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is this kind of idea, and we've talked about all time on Left Reckoning, but it's just this idea that like the American public is sort of sleepwalking their way through life. And maybe like, and what our goal is as like enlightened members of society is that we're going to shake people and wake them up, right? You see it on our side in the way people say, oh, I think everyone's a socialist. They just don't know enough yet, right? And look, I think political education is important because what political education does is not teach you that things are messed up and that you're being abused and your boss doesn't have your best interest. What it does is it connects a lot of things together so that you can see yourself as a member of a class, rather than yourself as an individual who sort of just has on the wrong end of the stick, right? Um, but this idea that like people are confused or bamboozled or don't understand the world around them, I think is a very, very big problem in a lot of like left wing outreach. And also just like on the level of like strategy. Like, if you think that like the problem is like we just haven't created the right media or we haven't put forward the right argument, right? We get questions all the time on the show, right, Matt, about how do I talk to this person or how do I talk to that person? How do I win this fight, right? And, I know it might be a little boring, but we always come back to the same thing. Like, the only thing that you can do is try to work very hard to build the organization and the unity and the effectiveness of yourself as a member of the working class to be able to build institutions and organizations that are able to achieve the things that we get at. Like, I just, like, you look at it time and time again. You look at like support for Medicare for all, extremely high. You look at support for unions, extremely high. The question here is not about waking up the sleeping masses, right? To like why these are the right ideas. It's showing them that doing this is in their benefit and will be achievable. A lot of people, when they hear things like a just transition, like Medicare for all, like higher rates of unionization, they're like, I want those things. I like those things, right? That's not the qualm. The qualm is, I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't know if I want to spend a lot of time with people on the outskirts of society, pushing for something that I don't think is going to work out. I might be more interested in sort of looking out for my immediate interests and my family's interests and trying to see if I can, create like an island for myself that is able to escape these things. And that's a bad mentality, right? I'm not saying that's not a problem, but it's a much more rational and realistic look at the world than this kind of idea that like all these people are just so confused. They don't understand the world around them. And you see this time and time again in media, right? Like the most recent thing was this like Marjorie Taylor Greene thing on 60 Minutes. And like, look, 60 Minutes sucks, y'all. Like, I don't think I have to say that, but just going to say that. Like, I watched the interview. I watched the full thing. It wasn't great. Stahl, right, didn't hit like the points she could have hit. But then there's all this kind of like, oh, they're platform Marjorie Taylor Greene, and like she's going to bamboozle and confuse people. It's like, the people who are already going to think that the Democratic Party is a cabal of like pedophiles were already there before they interacted with that sense of media. And I think more problematic for me than like the quality of the 60 Minutes thing is like this tendency on the left to be like, well, all these people are just like so easily bamboozled and so easily tricked by rhetoric from the right, that like, we have to be against this just like for the specific reason that they interviewed this person, because you have a very low expectation of your neighbors, your comrades, your coworkers, that they see something like this and they're going to get pulled into that stream. I think that's a really bad mentality to build a kind of strong working class movement. I think MTG is extremely dangerous. I think the movement she represents is very not just dangerous, it's cruel, it's wicked, and it's certainly not going to do anything to improve people's lives, right? I'm with you on all of those criticisms here, except for the one that you don't think that people have the ability to be able to work through these things. And even more so, I disagree with the idea that like what we need is for media elites in this country to sift through information and present it in a way to you or to the public at large that is like very explicit, like this is the bad idea, this is the good idea, right? Because I think it's a very infantilizing idea. I think it's very condescending. And look, the right exists in this country, and the right is growing in ways that it should alarm you, right? And the way that we have to deal with that is by building our own like expressing and like building up platforms to be able to do this, our own view of the world, so that we're pulling people towards us versus sort of hoping that super, super rich and influential people are sort of telling people this is good idea, this is bad idea, right? And this fixation that we've seen since Trump came into power, that we sort of want these people sitting at the top of society to sort of designate to the masses truth and fiction, I've found to be a very, very dangerous outsourcing of what is our responsibility to be building something that is not only critiquing and saying Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Trump movement, etc., don't got nothing for you. And in fact, they are against your interests, right? But we're also building something that can achieve those kind of interests.
Yeah, I mean, that's the 2 points. One is just that, faith and fellow man democracy point, where it's similar to the rank and file. Like, is UAW going to trust its rank and file to do this stuff, or do they need to be shepherded? The second is you're giving 60 Minutes way too much credit. Okay, so what if they pulled the Marjorie Taylor Greene thing, right? And they even conceded, Leslie Stahl didn't do a good job here, we're pulling it. Well, then what you've done is frankly legitimize the rest of 60 Minutes when they have Larry Summers come on like 8 times a year, on and say like working people, need to starve more, and this is just like what the numbers tell me.
Or on the other side. Or on the other
But
side, what if it was just an epic Jon Stewart style hypocrisy segment? Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't think that moves us any closer to building a working class movement in this country. Do you get what I mean? Like, even
I
if like
mean,
the
yeah,
content was good in the sense of like, oh, every point she made's debunked. I guess like here's what I'm saying. It's like we know we criticize the media all the time. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. I think what bothers me, Matt, is or what I'm trying to get at is the condescending mentality is
right.
that like people can't figure out for themselves these things. I think that that's a real impediment to building something different. Um, and I think it's a mentality that really needs to get dropped. Like, like, um, oh Lord, and help me. Who's the author of What's the Matter with Kansas? The Baffler.
Oh, now you've made it go out of my head.
Sorry, friend.
Shit,
Um,
sorry, bro.
Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank.
Frank, yeah,
Thomas
yeah.
Frank. And like, look, that's one of those books too, by the way, that people cite all the time by like naming the title of it, which is
We're
like
exactly
very,
wrong.
which is like not what he even argues in that book. What he argues is
Right.
that like the Democratic Party and the left in Kansas used to be for workers and they stopped being for workers. And then it wasn't surprising that the Republicans were able to take advantage of that. Like Thomas Frank's argument there is that the Democratic Party failed the voters there. They failed the working class there. Not that, oh, the people of Kansas are so stupid they can't understand what's going on around them. But again, like this is sort of like it just cited it. You just cite the title, and like this kind of like bad faith mentality. Bad faith is like a fancy term for like not knowing your own interests, not understanding yourself, and acting in a different way. And I'm going to talk more like theoretically about this using like Marx and stuff on Thursday. So I don't want to jump too much into it, but like the ideology as the reason that like ideology in the sense of like the way that people understand the world around them that's sort of given to us through media, through culture, through education, is what is creating this crisis. I think is wrong. I think it's wrong, and it was a bad turn from the left, and it should not surprise people that this is something that came about at the time when left wing and Marxist or Marx adjacent intellectuals turned their back on class analysis and went almost entirely into culture. Right, this is when this thing becomes sort of dominant in like left wing thought, and you see what the results are. Right, and, you can criticize movies and television all you want, but has that got us any closer to a strong working class movement in this country? I don't think you can
Yeah.
say that.
Well,
Um,
also, I mean, this goes back to this does go back to Trump winning, and it is like the false reasoning that it was because CNN cut to his debates and gave him free earned media,
yeah,
which they did. But that's the reason he won. And no, like the reason they did that and the reason he won are basically the same thing. Because he was good TV and going to win the
totally.
presidency against somebody who sucked. like that's like I think yeah, I think it is all just like trying to blame media for what was a political failing.
So that's the the longer version of the quick take. I'm talking about this more in depth on Thursday. I will just respond, since this is more of a Griscom stream topic, to something in the chat. Shami says, I agree with you, David, but who on the left are you talking about? I haven't heard anyone on the left that I respect talk or think like that. Would appreciate a steer as to who you were talking about. I don't mean this as a cop out, but like, look, this is something I experience all the time. And if you don't believe me, like go on my Twitter right now. I was arguing with people all morning about this. You can see me going back and forth with folks on this very specific topic. Slavoj Žižek, for example, is somebody who promotes this idea. If you want like a big figure, I highly suggest watching his debate with Vivek Chibber on the question of ideology. Zizek, somebody I like, I'm interested in. I've read a lot of his stuff, probably more than most other people. Not trying to whatever, but like I was like really into Lacan and psychoanalysis for a long time, so I spent a very prolonged Zizekian period of my life. But that's somebody who makes these kind of arguments, right? Like this is like. If you don't believe me, fine. But like I experience this all the time in my regular.
I think the general vibe about I mean, you could read it more charitably as people were going to say, "Oh, 60 Minutes is going to do a bad job," but there were people saying just the mere fact that this media product
Well, the
exists is a
platforming thing,
failing.
it's almost a separate issue, but the platforming thing, I also think, is, again, something that's inherited not from Marxism or socialism, but something that's inherited from liberalism, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, here's the thing that, like, where maybe me and Ben even disagree. I'm actually like less worked up about people as a community like showing up at somebody's talk and like coming at them, right? Than other folks are, because I think that that's a very real expression of community power, right? But I might disagree with some of the people in the membership there saying, "Oh, the platforming is a problem." The problem is that these are bad ideas that we have to defeat and engage with and destroy, right?
Yeah.
Versus saying like, "Oh, if these things get a platform, then they will become powerful," right? Which is, again, like a very liberal idealist way of looking at politics, right? Where it's like ideas shape the world rather than material conditions. Anyways, like I'm like spoiling the deck for what I'm going to talk about on Thursday. So if this titillated your interest, come and watch the Griscom stream Thursday afternoon, and I'll get way more depth
Yeah.
into this than I will right now.
I will just quote John Milton, probably liberal, but revolutionary. I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue. And that's what he wrote in
There you
Areopagitica
go.
about anti-freedom of speech. Yeah, that's what a lot of people want. And it's just like, that shit doesn't work. Like,
Yeah.
even if you want it to work, it's there's nothing to it. There's nothing behind it.
Well, friends and Left Reckoners, we're going to jump over the post game. Matt, since he did such a historical task of indicting Trump himself, overcoming the other jurors,
I'm
just
going
kidding,
to
folks. Just to be very clear.
going to break down all of the laws that I disregarded in pushing for this indictment.
No, but Matt and I are going to talk about it because, like, I have probably like a pretty mainstream lefty socialist take on. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but it's a big historical deal. So we're going to chat about that. We're going to be taking your calls and questions. I have a quick segment on trains in Texas that we'll do. And we'll see all of y'all over there. Don't forget, you can leave us a message at 1940-289-7234. Appreciate everyone so much. And we'll see y'all in just a couple minutes. Patreon.com/leftreckoning.
Peace.